The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Ravencrest Palace as Captain Marcus Whitmore adjusted his ceremonial sword for the third time in 10 minutes. 23 years of royal service had taught him to trust his instincts, and today every fiber of his being screamed danger. The palace felt different somehow, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made the ornate walls seem to close in around him. Princess Elena Ravencrest, barely 16 years old, walked beside him with the practiced grace of someone born to rule. Her auburn hair caught the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, and her emerald eyes held a wisdom far beyond her years. She had requested this early morning walk through the East Wing, claiming she needed time to think before the day's ceremonies began. Marcus had agreed, though he made sure to position 2 additional guards at strategic points along their route. "You seem troubled today, Captain," Elena observed, her voice carrying the melodic accent of the Ravencrest lineage. "Your jaw is tight, and you've checked your weapon more times than usual. What concerns you?" Marcus appreciated the princess's keen observation skills. Unlike many royals who remained oblivious to the security details surrounding their lives, Elena had always shown genuine interest in understanding the protocols designed to protect her. It was one of many reasons he had grown so protective of her over the years, watching her transform from a precocious child into the thoughtful young woman walking beside him. "Your Highness, there have been some unusual communications intercepted by our intelligence division," Marcus replied, keeping his voice low. "Nothing concrete enough to warrant canceling today's events, but sufficient to heighten our alertness levels." The day ahead was particularly significant. Queen Isabella had arranged for Princess Elena to receive the ceremonial crown of St. Marguerite, a tradition marking the formal recognition of the heir apparent. The crown, adorned with sapphires and diamonds passed down through 7 generations, would officially designate Elena as next in line for the throne. The ceremony would be attended by dignitaries from across the kingdom and several neighboring nations. However, the political landscape had grown increasingly complex in recent months. Queen Regent Vivian Blackthorne, Isabella's sister-in-law, had been vocal about her belief that the succession laws needed modernization. Her arguments, while presented under the guise of progressive reform, had not gone unnoticed by those loyal to the traditional line of succession. Marcus had studied the woman carefully and found her ambitions concerning. "Has this anything to do with Aunt Vivian's recent speeches about succession reform?" Elena asked, demonstrating once again her acute political awareness. Marcus paused their walk near a window overlooking the palace gardens. The roses were in full bloom, their vibrant colors creating a stark contrast to the gray stone of the ancient walls. He chose his words carefully, knowing that while Elena deserved honesty, he must not create unnecessary alarm or appear to speak against a member of the royal family. "The Queen Regent has certainly been vocal about her political views," he said diplomatically. "Our concerns stem more from external threats that might seek to exploit any perceived divisions within the royal family." This was partially true. While foreign intelligence services were always monitoring the kingdom for signs of instability, Marcus's primary concern lay much closer to home. 3 days earlier, his contacts within the palace staff had reported unusual meetings between Queen Regent Vivian and several influential nobles who had historically opposed King Edmund's progressive policies. The meetings were not secret exactly, but they were not part of any official schedule either. More troubling was the information provided by Lady Margaret Ashford, Elena's longtime tutor and confidant. Margaret had served the royal family for over 30 years and possessed an almost supernatural ability to detect palace intrigue. She had approached Marcus privately, expressing concern about overheard conversations, suggesting that some viewed today's ceremony as premature, given Elena's young age. "Captain, may I speak freely?" Elena asked, her tone becoming more serious. "Always, Your Highness. I've noticed tension between Mother and Aunt Vivian. They try to hide it during formal functions, but I see how they watch each other, how their conversations carry undercurrents I don't fully understand." Mother seemed stressed about something beyond the usual pressures of ruling. Queen Isabella had indeed appeared more guarded in recent weeks, particularly when Queen Regent Vivienne was present. The 2 women had once been close, united in their shared loss when King Edmund died in that tragic hunting accident 5 years ago. But power, Marcus had learned, could strain even the strongest family bonds. "Your mother carries many burdens as queen," Marcus replied. "But I want you to know that regardless of any political complexities, your safety remains my absolute priority. That's why I need to discuss some additional protocols with you." They continued walking, passing portraits of previous monarchs whose painted eyes seemed to follow their movement. Elena paused before a particular painting of her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria Ravencrest, who had ruled during a period of significant social change. The resemblance between Elena and her ancestor was striking, from the determined set of their jawlines to the intelligent gleam in their eyes. "She faced challenges, too," Elena murmured, studying the portrait. "The history books say she had to navigate conspiracies and court intrigue that made her question whom she could trust. And she emerged stronger for it," Marcus added. "Just as you will." Their conversation was interrupted by the rapid approach of Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of Marcus's most trusted subordinates. Her usually composed demeanor showed cracks of concern as she approached with purposeful strides. Sarah had been monitoring communications throughout the night, and her presence at this hour suggested important developments. "Captain, I apologize for the interruption," Sarah said, offering a respectful nod to Princess Elena. "We've received word that requires your immediate attention." Marcus understood the coded language. Sarah's choice of words indicated a security matter that could not be discussed openly, even in front of the princess. He glanced at Elena, who had learned to read these subtle communications as well. "Your Highness, perhaps we should return you to your chambers so you can prepare for the morning's activities," Marcus suggested. "Of course," Elena agreed, though her expression indicated she understood the gravity of whatever news Sarah had brought. "But, Captain, I want your word that you'll keep me informed of anything that might affect today's ceremony or the safety of our family." "You have it, Your Highness." As they escorted Elena back through the winding corridors, Marcus's mind raced through various scenarios. The palace's security protocols were extensive, developed and refined over decades to address everything from foreign assassination attempts to domestic political upheaval. However, threats from within the royal family itself presented unique challenges that required delicate handling. The Ravencrest dynasty had ruled for over 4 centuries, surviving wars, economic crises, and social revolutions. The crown had passed from parent to child in an unbroken chain, with only minor disputes over succession rights. Queen Isabella's claim to the throne had been undisputed following King Edmund's death, as she was his legally wedded queen and Elena was their acknowledged heir. However, Queen Regent Vivian's position was more complex. As King Edmund's sister, she held significant influence within the royal council and commanded respect from many traditionalist nobles. Her appointment as Queen Regent had been intended as a gesture of family unity, allowing her to serve as an advisor and representative of the crown during certain ceremonial functions. But power, once tasted, was rarely relinquished willingly. Upon reaching Elena's private quarters, Marcus watched as she disappeared behind the heavy oak doors, attended by her personal staff. Lady Margaret Ashford emerged moments later, her weathered face creased with the same concern that Marcus felt in his bones. "Captain, a word," Lady Margaret requested. The three of them moved to a small anteroom where they could speak privately. Lady Margaret had served as more than just Elena's tutor. She had become a surrogate grandmother to the princess, and a trusted advisor to Queen Isabella. Her loyalty to the Ravencrest family was absolute, which made her next words all the more alarming. "I've been monitoring correspondence as you requested," Lady Margaret began, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 letters arrived during the night, all bearing the seal of noble houses that have historically supported alternative succession claims. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. Alternative succession claims referred to distant relatives who might have theoretical rights to the throne under certain interpretations of ancient laws. Such claims were typically meaningless unless they gained significant political or military support. "What was the nature of these letters?" he asked. "They were addressed to Queen Regent Vivian, marked as confidential," Lady Margaret continued. "I couldn't intercept them without risking detection, but their timing is suspicious. All 3 houses have representatives attending today's ceremony." Lieutenant Sarah consulted her tablet, cross-referencing the guest list with intelligence files. "Lord Blackwood of the Northern Territories, Duchess Catherine of Westmarch, and Count Alessandro of the Eastern Provinces. All three have made subtle comments in recent months about the need for mature leadership during these challenging times. The implications were clear. If these nobles were coordinating with Queen Regent Vivienne, they might be planning to challenge Elena's recognition as heir apparent during or immediately after the ceremony. Such a challenge would not be treasonous in the technical sense, as they would likely argue they were acting within their rights to question succession protocols. However, it would create a constitutional crisis that could destabilize the entire kingdom. "Have there been any changes to today's security arrangements?" Marcus asked Sarah. "Queen Regent Vivienne requested additional ceremonial guards from the Northern Regiment," Sarah reported. She cited the importance of the occasion and the number of foreign dignitaries attending. The request was approved by Queen Isabella yesterday. Marcus's blood ran cold. The Northern Regiment was historically loyal to the noble houses of that region, including Lord Blackwood. While they were not disloyal to the crown, their primary allegiance was to their homeland rather than the royal family specifically. Having them present during such a delicate ceremony introduced variables that Marcus preferred to avoid. "How many additional guards are we talking about?" he asked. 20 ceremonial guards plus their commanding officer, Colonel Reynolds, Sarah replied. "They arrived last night and have been billeted in the East Barracks." Lady Margaret shook her head grimly. "Too many coincidences, Captain. The timing of the letters, the request for additional guards, the presence of these particular nobles, it feels orchestrated." Marcus agreed, but he also recognized the delicate position they were in. They could not accuse Queen Regent Vivienne of orchestrating a conspiracy without concrete evidence. Such accusations against a member of the royal family would be career-ending at best and potentially treasonous at worst. However, they could not ignore the mounting evidence that something significant was being planned for today's ceremony. "What are our options?" Lady Margaret asked. "Limited," Marcus admitted. "We can increase security around Princess Elena without making it appear obvious. We can ensure that our most trusted personnel are positioned at key points throughout the ceremony. And we can prepare contingency plans in case the situation escalates." "What kind of contingency plans?" Sarah inquired. Marcus had hoped this conversation would never be necessary, but his years of service had taught him to prepare for every possibility. "The emergency succession protocol," he said quietly. Both women stared at him in surprise. The emergency succession protocol was a classified procedure designed to protect the royal family during extreme circumstances that threatened the continuity of the monarchy. It had been developed following King Edmund's unexpected death, when the vulnerability of having a young heir became apparent. The protocol included provisions for secure relocation, communications procedures, and legal frameworks for maintaining royal authority during crisis situations. "You believe the threat is that serious?" Lady Margaret asked. "I believe we must be prepared for any possibility," Marcus replied. "If Queen Regent Vivienne and her allies are planning to challenge Elena's succession, they will likely wait until after the crown ceremony, when the symbolism is strongest and the audience is largest. That gives us several hours to prepare." The morning sunlight streaming through the windows had grown stronger, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between them. Outside palace staff were making final preparations for the day's events, unaware of the potential drama that might unfold. Gardeners tended to the ceremonial gardens, where some of the reception would take place, while kitchen staff prepared the elaborate feast that would follow the crown ceremony. "I need to speak with Queen Isabella privately," Marcus decided. "She must be made aware of our concerns so she can make informed decisions about how to proceed." "That may be difficult," Lady Margaret warned. Her schedule today is packed with pre-ceremony protocols, and Queen Regent Vivienne has been by her side since dawn, helping with preparations. The irony was not lost on Marcus. If their suspicions were correct, the very person they suspected of orchestrating a political challenge was currently positioned as the Queen's closest advisor and confidant. Vivienne's presence would make it nearly impossible to brief Isabella privately without arousing suspicion. "Then we proceed with discreet preparations," Marcus concluded. "Sarah, I want you to personally review the positioning of all ceremonial guards, both ours and the Northern Regiment personnel. Identify potential weaknesses in our coverage, and have backup personnel ready to move into position if needed." "Understood, Captain." "Lady Margaret, Can you arrange for Elena to have a private moment with her mother before the ceremony? Even 5 minutes would be sufficient for me to communicate our concerns. I can try, but it will require creativity. Perhaps if Elena requested a private blessing or mother-daughter moment before the crown ceremony, that would be emotionally appropriate and difficult for anyone to refuse. Marcus nodded approvingly. Excellent. Make it happen. As they prepared to disperse and implement their plans, Lady Margaret placed a gentle hand on Marcus's arm. Captain, in all your years of service, have you ever faced a situation quite like this? Marcus considered the question carefully. He had protected the royal family through assassination attempts, terrorist threats, natural disasters, and political upheavals. He had faced external enemies who sought to harm the monarchy from outside the kingdom's borders. However, this situation was different because the potential threat came from within the royal family itself, making traditional security protocols inadequate. No, he admitted, this is uncharted territory for all of us. Then we must trust our instincts and our loyalty to Princess Elena and Queen Isabella, Lady Margaret said firmly. Whatever Queen Regent Vivienne may be planning, our duty remains clear. As they left the anteroom and began implementing their respective responsibilities, Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down upon him. The Ravencrest dynasty had survived for 4 centuries, but that survival had often depended upon the courage and dedication of those sworn to protect it. Today, that responsibility fell heavily upon his shoulders. The palace continued its morning routines around them, but Marcus saw everything through the lens of potential security threats. Servants carrying trays could be concealing weapons. Nobles arriving for the ceremony could be coordinating political challenges. Even the ceremonial decorations could hide surveillance equipment. Or worse, his thoughts turned to Princess Elena, who had shown such maturity and wisdom during their morning conversation. She deserved the chance to inherit her birthright and lead the kingdom into the future. The ceremony today was meant to celebrate that future and provide stability during uncertain times. Marcus would not allow political machinations to rob her of that destiny. As the morning progressed and the first guests began arriving at the palace, Marcus positioned himself where he could observe both the ceremonial preparations and the interactions between key political figures. Queen Regent Vivienne moved through the crowds with practiced grace, greeting dignitaries and ensuring all protocols were properly observed. To casual observers, she appeared to be fulfilling her duties admirably. However, Marcus noticed subtle patterns in her behavior. She spent longer conversations with the 3 nobles Lady Margaret had identified, and their discussions appeared more intense than typical ceremonial pleasantries. She also made several trips to consult with Colonel Reynolds of the Northern Regiment, ostensibly about security arrangements but lasting longer than such consultations typically required. The pieces of a complex political puzzle were falling into place, and Marcus realized that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of Princess Elena's succession, but potentially the future of the entire Ravencrest dynasty. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing them closer to the moment when all their preparations would be tested. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Marcus knew that his oath of loyalty would guide his actions. He had sworn to protect Princess Elena with his life, and today, that oath would be tested in ways he had never imagined possible. The ceremonial bells of Ravencrest Palace began their ancient melody at precisely 11 o'clock, signaling the commencement of the crown ceremony. Captain Marcus Whitmore positioned himself at his designated post near the throne room's eastern entrance, where he could observe both the assembled dignitaries and maintain visual contact with Princess Elena throughout the proceedings. The ornate chamber, with its soaring Gothic arches and magnificent tapestries depicting centuries of royal history, had been transformed into a theater of political significance. Princess Elena entered the throne room with regal composure that belied her 16 years. The ceremonial gown, crafted from deep blue silk and embroidered with silver thread in patterns representing the 4 regions of the kingdom, had been worn by royal heirs for 3 generations. The crown of Saint Sistius, Marguerite, resting on a velvet cushion carried by the archbishop, caught the light from the massive crystal chandeliers and cast prismatic reflections across the assembled crowd. Queen Isabella stood beside the ancient throne, her own crown gleaming with diamonds and emeralds that had adorned monarchs since the dynasty's founding. Her posture was perfectly erect, her expression serene, but Marcus detected the subtle signs of tension in the tight grip she maintained on her ceremonial scepter and the barely perceptible tightness around her eyes. His brief conversation with her earlier had been successful, though necessarily cryptic given Queen Regent Vivian's constant presence. The exchange had occurred during a moment when Vivian stepped away to coordinate with the ceremonial protocol officers. Marcus had used those precious seconds to convey his concerns about potential challenges to the succession, speaking in the coded language that Isabella understood from years of security briefings. Her response had been equally subtle, a slight nod and a murmured instruction to maintain all necessary precautions. Now, as the ceremony began in earnest, Marcus watched Queen Regent Vivian take her position among the royal family members. She wore a gown of deep purple, a color traditionally associated with royal advisors and regents. Her demeanor was appropriately solemn for the occasion, but Marcus noticed how her gaze frequently swept across the assembled nobles, making brief eye contact with Lord Blackwood, Duchess Catherine, and Count Alessandro in turn. Archbishop Cornelius, a man whose service to the crown spanned 4 decades, began the traditional invocation that would precede Elena's recognition as heir apparent. His voice, strengthened by years of delivering sermons in the great cathedral, carried clearly throughout the throne room as he spoke of duty, service, and the sacred bond between ruler and kingdom. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness and celebrate a moment of profound significance in the history of our great kingdom, the Archbishop intoned. Princess Elena Ravencrest, daughter of our beloved Queen Isabella and the late King Edmund, shall receive the crown of St. Carlisle, Marguerite, marking her formal recognition as heir apparent to the throne. The assembled dignitaries responded with the traditional phrase of acceptance, their voices creating a harmonious chorus that echoed off the stone walls. Marcus noted that Lord Blackwood's response seemed slightly delayed, while Duchess Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral. Count Alessandro appeared more obviously supportive, but Marcus had learned not to trust surface appearances when dealing with noble court politics. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, positioned near the main entrance, caught Marcus's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. This signal indicated that no immediate external threats had been detected, but also confirmed that the Northern Regiment Guards were maintaining their positions throughout the palace. Colonel Reynolds stood with military precision near the western wall, his ceremonial sword gleaming at his side. As the ceremony progressed through its traditional phases, Marcus found his attention divided between monitoring potential security threats and appreciating the historical magnitude of the moment. Elena would be the youngest heir apparent to be formally recognized in over 2 centuries, and her eventual ascension to the throne would mark the first time in the kingdom's history that power passed from mother to daughter rather than from father to son or through male relatives. This gender-based transition, while legally unquestionable under current succession laws, had been a subject of quiet debate among certain traditionalist factions. Marcus knew that Queen Regent Vivian had occasionally made comments about the challenges facing young female rulers, though always framed as concern rather than opposition. However, those comments had taken on new significance in light of recent political developments. Your Highness, Archbishop Cornelius addressed Elena directly. Do you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom according to their respective laws and customs? I solemnly promise so to do, Elena replied, her voice clear and strong despite the weight of the moment. Will you to your power cause law and justice in mercy to be executed in all your judgments? I will. The traditional questions continued, each response binding Elena more firmly to her future responsibilities as monarch. Marcus had witnessed similar ceremonies before, but this one felt different, charged with political undercurrents that made every word significant beyond its ceremonial meaning. As the questioning phase neared its conclusion, Marcus noticed increased activity among the Northern Regiment Guards. Several of them had subtly adjusted their positions, moving closer to key exits and strategic points throughout the throne room. While such movements could be explained as routine security protocols, their timing seemed coordinated in a way that made Marcus increasingly uncomfortable. Queen Regent Vivian stepped forward as the ceremony reached the moment when family members would offer their formal support for Elena's recognition as heir apparent. This was typically a ceremonial formality, with brief statements of support from senior royal family members. However, Marcus realized that this moment also presented an opportunity for political challenges to be raised in the most public and symbolic setting possible. Your Majesty, Vivian addressed Queen Isabella with perfect protocol. As Queen Regent and sister to our beloved late King Edmund, I stand before this assembled gathering to offer my thoughts on this momentous occasion. The phrasing was unusual. Traditional protocol called for simple statements of support, not extended commentary. Marcus felt his hand instinctively move closer to his weapon as he prepared for whatever might come next. Princess Elena has grown into a remarkable young woman under your guidance. Vivian continued, her voice carrying clearly throughout the now silent throne room. Her intelligence, compassion, and dedication to our kingdom's welfare have been evident to all who have had the privilege of knowing her. So far, nothing controversial. Marcus remained alert, but began to wonder if his suspicions had been overly pessimistic. However, Vivian continued, and Marcus felt the atmosphere in the room shift subtly. I would be remiss in my duties as Queen Regent if I did not voice certain concerns that have been brought to my attention by loyal subjects of the crown. The traditional ceremony had just taken an unprecedented turn. Marcus glanced toward Lieutenant Sarah, who had moved closer to her designated emergency position. Lady Margaret Ashford, seated among the court officials, had gone pale but maintained her composure. These concerns, Vivian pressed on, relate not to Princess Elena's character or potential as a future ruler, but rather to the wisdom of formalizing succession arrangements at such a young age, during a period of significant political and economic challenges facing our kingdom. Queen Isabella's expression remained carefully controlled, but Marcus could see the tension in her posture increase. This was exactly the type of public challenge they had feared, delivered in a setting where any response would be fraught with political consequences. Furthermore, Vivian continued, several noble houses have expressed concerns about the precedent being set by recognizing an heir apparent who has not yet reached the age of majority, particularly given the complex international relations and domestic challenges that our next monarch will inevitably face. Lord Blackwood stepped forward from his position among the assembled nobles. Your Majesty, if I may be permitted to speak? The request was technically within protocol, as senior nobles had traditional rights to address the crown during certain ceremonial occasions. However, the coordination between his timing and Vivian's comments made Marcus realize that they were witnessing a carefully orchestrated political challenge. Queen Isabella faced an impossible choice. She could deny Lord Blackwood the right to speak, which would appear tyrannical and potentially validate claims that she was avoiding legitimate concerns. Alternatively, she could allow him to continue, risking further escalation of what was already becoming a public questioning of Elena's succession. Lord Blackwood, you may address the throne. Queen Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. Your Majesty, I speak not from personal ambition, but from genuine concern for the stability and prosperity of our kingdom. Lord Blackwood began. The past 5 years since King Edmund's tragic death have been marked by numerous challenges, economic difficulties, border tensions with neighboring kingdoms, and social changes that require experienced leadership to navigate successfully. Marcus realized that Lord Blackwood was laying the groundwork for what amounted to a motion of no confidence in Elena's readiness to serve as heir apparent. The legal and constitutional implications were staggering, as no such challenge had been mounted during a succession ceremony in the kingdom's recorded history. While Princess Elena has shown admirable qualities, Lord Blackwood continued, many of us believe that the kingdom would be better served by delaying formal succession arrangements until she has gained additional experience and maturity. Furthermore, we question whether it is appropriate to bind the kingdom to succession plans that were made during a period of grief and may not reflect careful consideration of all alternatives. The alternatives reference was the most dangerous part of his statement. Marcus knew that certain interpretations of ancient succession laws could potentially support claims by distant relatives or even lateral family members under specific circumstances. Queen Regent Vivian, as King Edmund's sister, could theoretically present such a claim, though it would require significant legal justification and political support. Duchess Catherine of Westmarch stepped forward next, clearly part of the coordinated challenge. Your Majesty, the noble houses of the western provinces have instructed me to express similar concerns. We believe that additional time for consideration would allow for broader consultation with regional leaders, and perhaps the establishment of a Regency Council to guide Princess Elena's preparation for eventual succession. Count Alessandro's participation completed the triumvirate of regional opposition. The eastern provinces echo these sentiments, Your Majesty. We propose a postponement of today's recognition ceremony to allow for proper consultation and consideration of all legal and practical factors affecting the succession. The throne room had become completely silent except for the sound of rustling fabric as dignitaries shifted nervously in their seats. Marcus realized they were witnessing either a constitutional crisis or a carefully planned coup disguised as legal procedure. Either way, the situation had moved far beyond normal security protocols. Queen Isabella stood slowly, her movement causing the assembled crowd to tense with anticipation. Her response would determine whether the challenge could be contained within legal and political channels or whether it would escalate into something far more dangerous. Lord Blackwood, Duchess Catherine, Count Alessandro, she began, her voice carrying the authority of 4 centuries of royal tradition. Your concerns have been noted and will be given the consideration they deserve. Marcus wondered if she would attempt to diffuse the situation through diplomatic language or take a stronger stance that might provoke further confrontation. However, the Queen continued, I must point out that today's ceremony is not legally binding in the sense that some of you appear to believe. The recognition of Princess Elena as heir apparent is a formal acknowledgement of existing succession laws, not the creation of new ones. Those laws were established by Parliament and previous monarchs over centuries of legal precedent. Her response was legally sound and demonstrated her understanding of constitutional law. However, Marcus recognized that legal correctness might not be sufficient to resolve what was essentially a political challenge disguised as legal procedure. Queen Regent Vivian stepped forward once again. Your Majesty, while your interpretation of succession law is certainly one perspective, there are historical precedents for reconsidering succession arrangements when circumstances warrant such reconsideration. The Regency Act of 1823, for example, established procedures for exactly such situations. Marcus felt his blood run cold. The Regency Act of 1823 had been created following a period of political instability when the sitting monarch was deemed unfit to rule due to mental illness. If Vivian was invoking that precedent, she might be suggesting that Queen Isabella was somehow unfit to make succession decisions, or that external circumstances warranted extraordinary measures. Princess Elena, who had remained silent throughout this unprecedented exchange, stepped forward with a dignity that impressed even Marcus, who had watched her grow up within the palace walls. Your Majesty, Lord Blackwood, distinguished guests, Elena addressed the room, I appreciate the concerns that have been raised about my readiness to serve as heir apparent. However, I would like to remind everyone present that succession laws exist precisely to provide stability and continuity during uncertain times. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. My father, King Edmund, faced similar questions about his readiness when he inherited the crown at age 22. My great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, was only 18 when she began her reign, which history remembers as one of the most successful in our kingdom's history. Marcus felt a surge of pride in Elena's response. She was demonstrating exactly the kind of mature leadership that her critics claimed she lacked. Furthermore, Elena continued, I submit that postponing recognition ceremonies due to political concerns sets a dangerous precedent that could be used to challenge any succession that proves inconvenient to particular political interests. The implication was clear. She was suggesting that the challenge was motivated by political ambition rather than genuine concern for the kingdom's welfare. Such a direct accusation was risky, but it also demonstrated the kind of political courage that effective monarchs required. Lord Blackwood's face reddened slightly at the implicit criticism. Your Highness, no one questions your intelligence or eventual potential as a ruler. However, the responsibilities of monarchy extend far beyond ceremonial functions and require experience with complex diplomatic, military, and economic challenges. Experience that I will gain through years of preparation while serving as heir apparent. Elena replied smoothly. Experience that will be enhanced by the guidance of my mother, the Queen, and the Council of Advisors, who have successfully navigated our kingdom through 5 years of challenges since my father's death. The exchange had become a public debate about Elena's qualifications and readiness, which was exactly what Marcus had hoped to avoid. However, he had to admit that Elena was acquitting herself admirably under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Queen Regent Vivian raised her hand to request attention. Perhaps we might consider a compromise that addresses everyone's concerns while maintaining respect for legal precedent and family unity. Marcus tensed, recognizing that compromise proposals often represented the most dangerous moments in political confrontations. Vivian was positioning herself as a reasonable mediator while potentially advancing her own interests. I propose that we proceed with today's ceremony as planned, Vivian continued, but with the understanding that Princess Elena's formal recognition as heir apparent will be subject to review by a special council comprised of representatives from all major noble houses, senior clergy, and legal scholars. The proposal was cleverly constructed. It would allow the ceremony to continue, satisfying those who supported Elena, while creating an ongoing political process that could potentially undermine her position over time. Such a council would be subject to political pressure and could theoretically reverse today's recognition if circumstances changed. Queen Isabella's response would determine whether this compromise represented a face-saving solution or a trap that would gradually erode Elena's position and legitimacy as heir apparent. Marcus realized that they had reached a critical decision point that would shape the future of the monarchy. The morning sunlight streaming through the stained-glass windows had shifted, casting different patterns of colored light across the throne room floor. The ceremony that should have been a celebration of continuity and tradition had become a complex political negotiation with implications that would reverberate throughout the kingdom for years to come. Whatever Queen Isabella decided, Marcus knew that his responsibilities as captain of the royal guard were about to become far more complex and dangerous than he had ever anticipated. The tension in the throne room had reached a breaking point when Queen Isabella raised her scepter, the traditional signal for silence during royal proclamations. Captain Marcus Whitmore watched as every person in the ornate chamber turned their attention to the throne, aware that the Queen's next words would determine the immediate future of the Ravencrest dynasty and potentially reshape the kingdom's political landscape forever. Queen Regent Vivienne, Isabella began, her voice carrying the authority accumulated through 5 years of ruling during increasingly difficult times. Your proposal for a review council has been noted. However, I must respectfully decline to subject the lawful succession of this kingdom to political review by any body not explicitly authorized by our Constitution. Marcus felt a mixture of relief and concern wash over him. The Queen's rejection of the compromise was legally sound and demonstrated strong leadership, but it also meant that the political confrontation would continue to escalate rather than being diffused through diplomatic means. Furthermore, Queen Isabella continued, I find it troubling that these concerns about Princess Elena's readiness have been raised publicly during a ceremonial occasion rather than through the proper channels of royal council meetings or private consultation. Such behavior suggests motivations beyond genuine concern for the kingdom's welfare. The accusation was direct and unmistakable. Isabella was publicly questioning the motives of Queen Regent Vivian and her allies, transforming what had begun as a challenge to Elena's succession into a broader confrontation about the loyalty and intentions of senior royal family members. Lord Blackwood stepped forward again, his face flushed with anger at the implication that his concerns were politically motivated rather than genuine. Your Majesty, I have served this crown faithfully for 30 years. My loyalty to the Ravencrest dynasty is beyond question, which is precisely why I feel compelled to voice concerns about decisions that could weaken the monarchy's stability. And yet, Princess Elena interjected with remarkable composure, for someone whose future was being debated before an audience of foreign dignitaries and domestic political leaders. Your definition of stability appears to require undermining legally established succession procedures whenever they produce outcomes that displease certain political factions. The exchange had evolved into something far more dangerous than Marcus had anticipated. What began as ceremonial objections had become open accusations of disloyalty, flying between members of the royal family and senior nobles. Such public discord within the monarchy could have catastrophic consequences for the kingdom's internal stability and international standing. Duchess Catherine of Westmarch attempted to shift the tone toward more diplomatic language. Your Majesty, Princess Elena, perhaps we might step back from personal accusations and focus on our shared commitment to the kingdom's welfare. Surely we can find common ground that respects both legal precedent and legitimate concerns about the challenges facing our next generation of leadership. However, her attempt at mediation was undermined by Count Alessandro, who chose that moment to reveal the true scope of the political challenge they were mounting. Your Majesty, I believe it's important for you to understand that the concerns we've expressed today are supported by a formal petition signed by representatives of 7 major noble houses, 3 regional governors, and the Leadership Council of the Merchants Guild. Marcus realized that they were not dealing with a spontaneous challenge, or even a loosely coordinated political maneuver. Instead, they faced a carefully organized opposition movement that had been building support across multiple sectors of the kingdom's political and economic leadership. Furthermore, Count Alessandro continued, this petition requests the establishment of a formal Regency Council to oversee royal decision-making until Princess Elena reaches the age of 25, at which time her fitness for eventual succession would be re-evaluated based on demonstrated experience and capability. The implications were staggering. A Regency Council with the power to oversee royal decision-making would effectively remove Queen Isabella from meaningful authority while preventing Elena from assuming her rightful position as heir apparent. Such an arrangement would concentrate power in the hands of the noble houses and other political interests that had organized the petition. Marcus caught Lieutenant Sarah Chen's eye across the throne room and noted her subtle hand signal indicating that additional security personnel were moving into position. The situation had clearly moved beyond ceremonial protest into territory that could threaten the personal safety of the royal family members. Queen Regent Vivienne, seeing the shock and anger on Queen Isabella's face, attempted to present the regency proposal as reasonable and beneficial. Sister, she said, using the familiar address that emphasized their family relationship, please understand that this proposal comes from love and concern for both you and Elena. The past 5 years have placed enormous burdens on your shoulders, and perhaps it's time to accept assistance from those who want to share those responsibilities. The use of sister was particularly calculated, as it reminded everyone present of Vivienne's close family connection to the late King Edmund and her theoretical position within the succession hierarchy. It also suggested that the regency proposal was motivated by familial concern rather than political ambition. However, Marcus had studied Queen Regent Vivienne carefully over the years and recognized the sophisticated political maneuvering behind her apparently heartfelt appeal. A regency council dominated by her allies would effectively place her in control of royal authority while maintaining the appearance of serving the crown's interests. Aunt Vivienne, Princess Elena said, her use of the formal family address calculated to match Vivienne's tactical choice of language. I appreciate your concern for my mother's welfare and my own preparation for future responsibilities. However, I notice that your proposed solution involves removing decision-making authority from the elected monarch and placing it in the hands of unelected political interests. Elena's response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the democratic principles that had been gradually incorporated into the kingdom's constitutional monarchy over previous centuries. While the monarch retained significant ceremonial and legal authority, that authority was ultimately derived from popular consent and constitutional law rather than divine right or noble privilege. Moreover, Elena continued, I question the timing of these concerns. If my readiness for succession has been a genuine worry for 7 major noble houses and 3 regional governors, why were these concerns not raised through proper channels over the past several months or years? Why wait until a formal ceremony attended by foreign dignitaries to mount what amounts to a public challenge to the monarchy's legitimacy? Her question struck at the heart of the political strategy being employed by Vivienne and her allies. By raising their objections during a public ceremony, they had created maximum political pressure while making it difficult for Queen Isabella to respond effectively without appearing to suppress legitimate concerns. Archbishop Cornelius, who had remained silent during the political exchanges, stepped forward with obvious discomfort at the unprecedented situation. Your Majesty, distinguished guests, perhaps we might consider suspending today's ceremony to allow for private consultation and reflection on these important matters. The Archbishop's suggestion offered a potential exit from the immediate confrontation, but Marcus recognized that any suspension or postponement would be interpreted as a victory for Vivienne's faction and would encourage further challenges to royal authority. Queen Isabella appeared to recognize the same dynamic. Archbishop Cornelius, I appreciate your concern for maintaining appropriate decorum during religious ceremonies. However, the matters raised today are political rather than spiritual, and I believe they should be addressed directly rather than avoided through postponement. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her posture reflecting the full authority of her position as sovereign. Members of the nobility, distinguished guests, representatives of our allied kingdoms, I want to address the allegations and proposals that have been raised during what should have been a celebratory ceremony. Marcus admired her decision to confront the challenge directly rather than seeking diplomatic compromises that would undermine her authority and Elena's position. However, he also recognized that such direct confrontation carried significant risks if it failed to decisively resolve the political crisis. First, Queen Isabella continued, let me address the question of Princess Elena's readiness to serve as heir apparent. The succession laws of this kingdom do not require heir apparents to demonstrate specific qualifications or experience before being recognized. They require only legitimate birth and proper legal standing, both of which Princess Elena possesses without question. Her legal argument was sound, but Marcus knew that political challenges often succeeded despite legal weaknesses if they gained sufficient popular or institutional support. Second, I want to address the proposal for a regency council. Such councils have historical precedent only in cases where the ruling monarch was deemed incapable of exercising royal authority due to illness, incapacity, or extreme circumstances threatening the kingdom's survival. No such circumstances exist today. The historical argument was accurate, but Marcus noticed that several of the nobles exchanged glances that suggested they might be prepared to argue that current political and economic challenges constituted the extreme circumstances that would justify extraordinary measures. Third, and most importantly, Queen Isabella's voice grew stronger. I want to address the manner in which these challenges have been presented. The use of a formal ceremony attended by foreign dignitaries to mount political challenges represents a breach of protocol that undermines not only the dignity of the monarchy, but also the kingdom's international standing. She paused, allowing her words to resonate throughout the silent throne room. Such behavior suggests that political considerations have taken precedence over loyalty to the crown and concern for the kingdom's welfare. The accusation was serious and direct. Isabella was essentially charging Queen Regent Vivienne and her allies with putting their own political interests ahead of their duties to the monarchy and the kingdom. Queen Regent Vivienne's response would be crucial. She could attempt to defend her actions and continue the confrontation, or she could seek to de-escalate the situation through diplomatic language and strategic retreat. Your Majesty, Vivienne replied after a lengthy pause, I regret that our legitimate concerns have been interpreted as political challenges rather than expressions of loyalty and dedication to the crown's long-term interests. Her tone was conciliatory, but the content of her response maintained the substance of her position while avoiding direct confrontation with Isabella's accusations. However, she continued, I believe the strength of support for these concerns, as evidenced by the petition Count Alessandro mentioned, suggests that they deserve serious consideration rather than dismissal. Marcus realized that Vivienne was attempting to maintain political pressure while avoiding the appearance of direct defiance. By referencing the petition with its multiple signatures, she was arguing that the challenges represented broad-based concerns rather than personal ambition. Furthermore, Vivienne pressed on, I believe that addressing these concerns openly and transparently would strengthen rather than weaken the monarchy by demonstrating its commitment to accountable governance and responsive leadership. The argument was sophisticated, positioning the regency proposal as a method of improving royal governance rather than limiting royal authority. However, Marcus recognized that such improvements would effectively transfer power from the royal family to the noble houses and political interests that had organized the petition. Princess Elena stepped forward once again, her youth contrasting sharply with the political sophistication she had demonstrated throughout the confrontation. Aunt Vivienne, you speak of transparency and accountability, which are indeed important principles of good governance. However, I would argue that the most transparent and accountable approach would be to honor the succession laws that have provided stability for our kingdom for 4 centuries. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. Moreover, true accountability requires that those who seek to change established procedures bear the burden of demonstrating why such changes are necessary and beneficial. The petition you reference may have impressive signatures, but signatures alone do not constitute evidence that change is needed or that proposed alternatives would be superior to existing arrangements. Elena's response impressed Marcus with its combination of respect for democratic principles and defense of constitutional monarchy. She was effectively challenging Vivienne's faction to provide substantive justification for their proposals, rather than relying on political pressure and implied threats. Additionally, Elena continued, I believe it's important to consider the precedent that would be established if succession procedures could be overturned through political pressure whenever they produced outcomes that displeased particular interest groups. Such a precedent would undermine the stability that succession laws are designed to provide. The argument was compelling, but Marcus knew that political confrontations were often decided by factors beyond logical arguments and legal precedents. The balance of political power, popular opinion, and international pressures could all influence the eventual outcome of this unprecedented challenge to royal authority. As the exchanges continued, Marcus became increasingly concerned about the security implications of the prolonged confrontation. The longer the ceremony continued without resolution, the greater the risk that emotions would escalate beyond the point where peaceful resolution was possible. Additionally, the presence of foreign dignitaries meant that any violence or serious disorder would have international consequences that could affect the kingdom's diplomatic relationships and economic interests. He caught the eye of Colonel Reynolds, who commanded the Northern Regiment Guards, whose loyalty was potentially questionable given their regional connections to Lord Blackwood. The colonel's expression was professionally neutral, but Marcus detected signs of tension that suggested the military personnel were also feeling the strain of the unprecedented political confrontation. The afternoon sun had moved across the sky during the extended ceremony, changing the patterns of light streaming through the stained glass windows. What should have been a brief celebratory occasion had become an hours-long political crisis, with implications that would reverberate throughout the kingdom regardless of how it was ultimately resolved. Marcus realized that they were approaching a decision point where continued political maneuvering would give way to more direct action by one side or the other. Queen Isabella and Princess Elena had successfully defended their legal and constitutional position, but Vivienne's faction retained significant political support and showed no signs of backing down from their challenge. The question that would determine the future of the Ravencrest dynasty was whether this confrontation could be resolved through political and diplomatic means, or whether it would escalate into something far more dangerous that would require the activation of emergency security protocols that Marcus had hoped never to implement. The late afternoon light streaming through the throne room's magnificent windows had taken on an amber quality, when Captain Marcus Whitmore noticed the subtle shift in Colonel Reynolds's posture that triggered every alarm bell in his security-trained mind. The Northern Regiment commander's hand had moved almost imperceptibly closer to his ceremonial sword, a movement that would have been meaningless during a normal ceremony but carried ominous implications during this unprecedented political confrontation. Marcus activated the discreet communication device hidden beneath his formal jacket, sending a coded signal to Lieutenant Sarah Chen and his other security personnel positioned throughout the palace. The signal indicated elevated threat status and authorized them to implement contingency protocols without waiting for further authorization. Years of training and preparation had led to this moment when the theoretical became terrifyingly real. The political exchanges between Queen Isabella, Princess Elena, and Queen Regent Vivienne had reached an impasse where neither side appeared willing to back down from their positions. Vivienne's faction maintained their demand for a regency council, supported by their petition from influential noble houses and political leaders. Meanwhile, Isabella and Elena stood firm on constitutional law and the legitimacy of existing succession procedures. "Your Majesty," Lord Blackwood said, his voice carrying a new edge of determination that made Marcus's blood run cold, "I believe the time for discussion has passed. The petition we have presented represents the will of significant portions of the nobility, regional leadership, and economic interests. Ignoring such widespread concern would be irresponsible governance." The shift in tone was unmistakable. Lord Blackwood had abandoned diplomatic language in favor of what amounted to an ultimatum. Marcus recognized that they had reached the point where political pressure would give way to more direct action. Furthermore, Lord Blackwood continued, I want to inform your majesty that representatives of the noble houses supporting this petition have taken preliminary steps to ensure that the kingdom's stability is maintained regardless of the outcome of today's discussions. The euphemistic language barely concealed the threat. Preliminary steps to ensure stability could mean anything from economic pressure to military action. But the implication was clear that Vivienne's faction had prepared for the possibility that their political challenge would be rejected. Marcus saw Queen Isabella's composure falter slightly for the first time during the entire confrontation. She had successfully defended her legal and constitutional position, but legal authority meant nothing if it could not be enforced against organized political and potentially military opposition. Princess Elena, however, seemed to find new strength in the face of escalating threats. Lord Blackwood, your language suggests that you and your allies have prepared to take action against the crown if your demands are not met. Such preparation would constitute treason under the laws of this kingdom. The accusation of treason brought absolute silence to the throne room. Even the foreign dignitaries who had been observing the political drama with fascination and concern seemed to recognize that the situation had moved beyond diplomatic crisis into territory that could involve violence and bloodshed.
Your Highness, Duchess Catherine interjected quickly. I believe Lord Blackwood's reference to stability measures should not be interpreted as threats against the crown, but rather as prudent preparations for potential political transitions. The attempt to soften Lord Blackwood's language was unconvincing, particularly given the coordinated nature of the political challenge that had been revealed throughout the afternoon. Marcus realized that Vivienne's faction had indeed prepared for multiple scenarios, including the possibility that their demands would be rejected and more forceful measures would become necessary. Queen Regent Vivienne stepped forward, apparently recognizing that the situation had escalated beyond her ability to maintain the appearance of reasonable political opposition. Your Majesty, perhaps we might adjourn today's proceedings to allow for private consultation and consideration of all options available to resolve this impasse. Her suggestion represented an attempt to de-escalate the immediate confrontation, but Marcus understood that any adjournment would provide opportunities for Vivienne's faction to implement whatever stability measures they had prepared. The security protocols he had studied suggested that allowing potential conspirators to regroup and coordinate outside the controlled environment of the throne room would be strategically disastrous. Queen Isabella appeared to reach the same conclusion. Queen Regent Vivienne, the suggestion of adjournment is noted. However, I believe the matters raised today require immediate resolution rather than further delay and private maneuvering. She stood, raising her scepter in the traditional gesture of royal authority. Therefore, I hereby formally reject the proposal for a Regency Council and reaffirm Princess Elena's recognition as legitimate heir apparent to the throne of this kingdom. The declaration was legally definitive and constitutionally sound. However, Marcus knew that the real test would be whether Isabella's formal authority could be enforced against organized opposition. Furthermore, Queen Isabella continued, I want to address directly the implications of the threats that have been made during this ceremony. Any actions taken against the lawful authority of this crown will be met with appropriate responses under the security protocols established to protect the monarchy and the kingdom's constitutional government. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and concern at Isabella's reference to security protocols. She was essentially warning Vivienne's faction that any attempt at a coup or forced political transition would trigger military and security responses designed to protect the royal family and preserve constitutional government. However, such protocols were only effective if the security forces themselves remained loyal to the crown. The presence of Northern Regiment guards throughout the palace, commanded by Colonel Reynolds, whose regional loyalties were potentially questionable, created uncertainties about the reliability of military support in case of direct confrontation. Count Alessandro chose that moment to reveal the true scope of the political conspiracy they were facing. Your Majesty, I believe you should be aware that the preliminary measures Lord Blackwood referenced include communications with commanders of regional military units and preliminary discussions with representatives of our allied neighboring kingdoms regarding the political situation developing within our realm. Marcus realized that Vivienne's faction had not only organized domestic political opposition, but had also reached out to foreign governments, potentially compromising the kingdom's sovereignty.
and creating opportunities for external interference in internal affairs. Such communications, Princess Elena responded with remarkable composure, would constitute treasonous collaboration with foreign powers in domestic political affairs, regardless of their stated intentions. The accusation escalated the confrontation to its highest level yet. Treason was a capital offense under the kingdom's legal code, and Elena's willingness to level such accusations demonstrated her understanding that the situation had moved far beyond normal political disagreement. Archbishop Cornelius, who had been attempting to maintain religious neutrality throughout the political exchanges, stepped forward with obvious distress at the deteriorating situation. "Your Majesty, Princess Elena, distinguished guests, I believe we have reached a point where continued public confrontation serves no constructive purpose and risks irreparable damage to the institutions we all claim to serve." His intervention represented an appeal for sanity and restraint from someone whose moral authority was respected across political factions. However, Marcus feared that the situation had already progressed beyond the point where religious mediation could prevent serious consequences. "I propose," the Archbishop continued, "that we suspend today's ceremony and convene a special council of senior clergy, constitutional scholars, and representatives of all major political factions to address these unprecedented circumstances, through careful deliberation rather than public confrontation." The proposal was reasonable and might have been acceptable earlier in the day, but Marcus recognized that it came too late to prevent the crisis from escalating further. Both sides had invested too much political capital in their positions to accept compromises that would leave fundamental issues unresolved. Queen Regent Vivian seized upon the Archbishop's intervention as an opportunity to present her faction's demands as reasonable and moderate. "Your Grace, your wisdom and spiritual guidance are greatly appreciated during these difficult circumstances. I believe a special council could indeed provide the framework for addressing legitimate concerns about succession procedures while maintaining respect for constitutional traditions." However, her apparent agreement with the Archbishop's proposal was undermined by the conditions she attached. Such a council would need to include representation from all the noble houses and regional governments that have expressed concerns, as well as independent legal scholars who can provide objective analysis of the constitutional questions involved. Marcus realized that Vivian was attempting to use the Archbishop's mediation proposal to legitimize her faction's political demands. A council, structured according to her specifications, would likely be dominated by her allies and could provide a veneer of legal authority for implementing the regency arrangement she had originally proposed. Princess Elena apparently recognized the same dynamic. "Your Grace, while I appreciate your efforts to promote peaceful resolution, I believe it's important to remember that some principles cannot be compromised without undermining the entire constitutional framework that protects our kingdom's stability." She turned to address the assembled crowd directly. "The succession laws that govern this monarchy have provided stability and continuity for 4 centuries. They have survived wars, economic crises, social changes, and political upheavals precisely because they are based on legal principles rather than political preferences." Elena's appeal to historical precedent and constitutional stability was compelling, but Marcus noticed that several of the foreign dignitaries appeared uncomfortable with the prolonged political crisis they were witnessing. International confidence in the kingdom's stability could be severely damaged if the succession dispute continued much longer, particularly if it escalated to violence or resulted in a prolonged period of uncertain government authority. The late afternoon sunlight had begun to fade, casting longer shadows across the throne room floor and creating an atmosphere of gathering twilight that seemed to match the darkening political situation. Marcus realized that they were approaching the moment when words would give way to actions, and the carefully maintained facade of political civility would collapse entirely. Colonel Reynolds stepped forward, his movement causing every security officer in the room to tense with anticipation.
"Your Majesty, if I may be permitted to address the throne on behalf of the military personnel present today."
The request was technically within protocol, as senior military officers had traditional rights to address the monarch during certain circumstances. However, given the political tensions and the questionable loyalties of the Northern Regiment, Marcus viewed Reynolds' intervention as potentially the most dangerous development yet. Queen Isabella faced another impossible choice. Denying a senior military officer the right to speak could appear tyrannical and might provoke the very military opposition she was trying to avoid. However, allowing Reynolds to speak could provide a platform for military support of the political challenge mounted by Vivienne's faction. "Colonel Reynolds, you may address the throne," Queen Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the obvious risks involved. "Your Majesty," Reynolds began, his military bearing emphasized by the formal uniform and ceremonial decorations that marked his distinguished service record. "I speak not as a representative of any political faction, but as a soldier sworn to protect this kingdom and its constitutional government." Marcus held his breath, knowing that the colonel's next words would determine whether the military would support or oppose the crown during this unprecedented crisis. "The soldiers under my command, like all military personnel in this kingdom, have sworn oaths of loyalty to the crown and to the constitutional order that the crown represents," Reynolds continued. "Those oaths do not permit us to choose sides in political disputes or to determine which interpretations of law and precedent should prevail." The statement appeared to support military neutrality, which could be interpreted as either positive or negative depending on the specific circumstances that developed. "However," Reynolds continued, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten with apprehension, "our oaths also require us to act in defense of constitutional government and the stability of the realm when those principles are threatened by any source, internal or external." The carefully worded statement maintained ambiguity about which side the military would support if the political confrontation escalated to direct conflict. Reynolds was essentially declaring that military forces would act to preserve constitutional order, but without specifying whether the current succession dispute constituted a threat to that order or represented legitimate constitutional debate. Marcus realized that Colonel Reynolds had positioned the military as the ultimate arbiters of constitutional legitimacy, which represented either a crucial source of support for Queen Isabella or a devastating blow to her authority, depending on how military leaders interpreted their constitutional obligations. The outcome of this unprecedented crisis would now depend on whether the military forces present in the palace viewed Queen Isabella's rejection of the regency proposal as legitimate constitutional authority or as stubborn resistance to justified political reform. That determination would shape not only the immediate resolution of the succession dispute, but also the future balance of power between the monarchy, the nobility, and the military establishment within the kingdom's constitutional system. The moment that would determine the fate of the Ravencrest dynasty arrived, when Captain Marcus Whitmore heard the distinctive sound of steel against leather as Colonel Reynolds drew his ceremonial sword. The action sent shockwaves throughout the throne room, as the drawing of weapons during a royal ceremony had not occurred within living memory and represented either an act of supreme loyalty or ultimate betrayal. Marcus's hand moved instinctively to his own weapon, but he forced himself to wait and observe before taking any action that could not be reversed. The political crisis had reached its climax, and the next few seconds would determine whether the kingdom faced civil war or renewed stability under the traditional monarchy. Colonel Reynolds held his sword high, the polished blade catching the remaining afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows. The entire throne room held its breath as he spoke the words that would echo through the kingdom's history. "Your Majesty Queen Isabella," Reynolds declared in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the great chamber. "I, Colonel James Reynolds of the Northern Regiment, reaffirm my oath of loyalty to the crown and to the constitutional order of this kingdom." Marcus felt a surge of relief as the colonel's words and actions indicated support for Queen Isabella, rather than participation in the political challenge mounted by Queen Regent Vivienne's faction. However, he remained alert to the possibility that this apparent declaration of loyalty could be followed by conditions or demands that would undermine its significance. "Furthermore," Reynolds continued, "I hereby declare that any attempt to undermine the lawful authority of the crown or to impose unauthorized governance structures upon this kingdom will be met with appropriate military response in defense of constitutional government." The declaration was unambiguous and decisive. Reynolds was publicly committing the military forces under his command to support Queen Isabella and Princess Elena against any attempts at forced political change. The symbolic power of his drawn sword emphasized the seriousness of his commitment and the consequences that would face anyone who persisted in challenging royal authority.
Queen Regent Vivienne's face went pale as she realized that her carefully orchestrated political challenge had suffered a catastrophic blow. Without military support, her faction lacked the power to enforce their demands for a regency council, or to implement the stability measures that had been referenced throughout the afternoon. Lord Blackwood stepped backward, his earlier confidence evaporating as the political calculations that had seemed so promising a few minutes earlier collapsed in the face of declared military opposition. The petition, with its impressive list of signatories, meant nothing if the armed forces refused to support political changes imposed against the Crown's wishes. "Colonel Reynolds," Lord Blackwood said, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been during his earlier challenges to royal authority, "I hope you understand that our concerns about succession arrangements were motivated by genuine desire to serve the kingdom's interests rather than personal ambition. The attempt to reframe their political challenge as patriotic concern rather than factional conspiracy was unconvincing, particularly given the threats and ultimatums that had been delivered throughout the ceremony. However, Marcus recognized that Lord Blackwood was attempting to create an exit strategy that would allow Vivienne's faction to withdraw without admitting to treasonous intentions. Princess Elena, who had demonstrated remarkable poise and political sophistication throughout the crisis, stepped forward to address the situation with a maturity that impressed even Marcus, who had watched her grow up within the palace walls. "Lord Blackwood, Duchess Catherine, Count Alessandro," she began, her voice carrying the authority she would need as future monarch while maintaining the diplomatic grace necessary to resolve the immediate crisis without unnecessary bloodshed or permanent political damage. "I appreciate that your concerns about my readiness to serve as heir apparent may have been genuinely motivated, even though I disagree with your conclusions and strongly disapprove of the methods chosen to express those concerns." Her words offered a face-saving interpretation of their actions, while making it clear that she understood the political nature of the challenge they had mounted. Marcus admired her diplomatic skill in providing an exit strategy that could prevent further escalation, while not appearing weak or indecisive. "However," Elena continued, her tone becoming more serious, "I want to make clear that any future challenges to the constitutional order of this kingdom must be conducted through proper legal and political channels rather than through public ultimatums, threats of external intervention, or attempts to organize unauthorized governance structures." Elena was establishing that while she would not pursue immediate retaliation against those who had challenged her succession, she would not tolerate future attempts at political coercion or constitutional manipulation. Queen Isabella stepped forward to support her daughter's diplomatic initiative while reinforcing the legal and constitutional principles that had been at stake throughout the crisis. "Princess Elena speaks wisely, and I want to add my own thoughts on the events we have witnessed today." She paused, allowing her words to carry the full weight of royal authority accumulated through 5 years of successful governance during challenging times. "The succession laws of this kingdom exist to provide stability and continuity during times of political uncertainty. Those laws cannot be subject to modification through political pressure or factional demands without undermining the very stability they are designed to protect." Isabella's restatement of constitutional principles served multiple purposes. It reinforced the legal foundation of Elena's succession while providing educational context for the foreign dignitaries who had witnessed the unprecedented political drama. Additionally, it established precedent for how similar challenges would be addressed in the future. Furthermore, Queen Isabella continued, "I want to address the concerning revelation that some of today's participants have communicated with representatives of foreign governments regarding internal political affairs. Such communications represent a serious breach of protocol and raise questions about the loyalties and judgment of those involved." The reference to foreign communications struck at the heart of the most serious allegations that had been raised during the confrontation. While the full extent of such communications remained unclear, their mere existence represented potential violations of law and certainly violated the norms of political conduct that were expected of senior nobles and government officials. Queen Regent Vivienne, recognizing that her political position had become untenable, attempted to minimize the significance of her faction's actions while positioning herself to salvage whatever influence she could retain within the royal family structure. "Your Majesty, I want to assure you that any communications with external parties were strictly informational and were motivated by desire to maintain international confidence in the kingdom's stability," she said,
her voice notably lacking the confidence she had displayed during her earlier political challenges. Such communications were not intended to invite foreign interference in domestic affairs or to undermine the sovereignty of our kingdom, she continued, though her explanation raised more questions than it answered about the nature and extent of external contacts. Marcus noted that Vivienne's attempt to justify foreign communications as efforts to maintain international confidence was contradicted by the reality that involving external parties in domestic succession disputes would have exactly the opposite effect on international perceptions of the kingdom's stability. Archbishop Cornelius, who had been attempting throughout the afternoon to promote peaceful resolution of the political crisis, stepped forward to offer religious perspective on the events that had unfolded. "Your Majesty, Princess Elena, distinguished guests," he began, "today has been a day of testing for our kingdom and for all of us who serve its people and institutions. While the political confrontations we have witnessed have been unprecedented in their intensity, I believe they have also demonstrated the strength of our constitutional system and the wisdom of our succession laws." The Archbishop's interpretation of events as a test that had been successfully passed provided a framework for understanding the crisis in positive terms, rather than viewing it as a sign of institutional weakness or political instability. "Moreover," he continued, "I believe that Princess Elena's conduct throughout today's challenges has demonstrated exactly the kind of mature leadership and constitutional understanding that our kingdom will need in the years ahead." The religious endorsement of Elena's performance during the crisis carried significant weight, particularly given the Archbishop's carefully maintained neutrality throughout the political exchanges. His support would help legitimize Elena's position and provide additional moral authority for the succession arrangements that had been challenged. Colonel Reynolds sheathed his sword with the same ceremonial precision he had displayed when drawing it, signaling that the immediate military crisis had passed and that constitutional order had been successfully defended. "Your Majesty," he addressed Queen Isabella, "with your permission, I would like to recommend that all military personnel present today be debriefed regarding the events we have witnessed and the constitutional principles that guided our response to unprecedented circumstances." The suggestion demonstrated professional military consideration for the broader implications of the day's events. Military personnel throughout the kingdom would need to understand the precedents established today and the constitutional framework that would guide their responses to any future political challenges. As the immediate crisis subsided, Marcus began to consider the longer-term security implications of what had occurred. While Queen Isabella and Princess Elena had successfully defended their constitutional positions, the revelation of organized political opposition and potential foreign communications created ongoing security concerns that would need to be addressed. Lady Margaret Ashford, who had observed the entire confrontation from her position among the court officials, approached Marcus with obvious relief, but also concern about future developments. "Captain," she said quietly, "I believe we need to conduct a thorough review of palace security protocols in light of what we learned today about the extent of organized opposition to the succession." Marcus agreed completely. The political challenge had revealed intelligence failures and security vulnerabilities that needed immediate attention. The fact that a coordinated opposition movement had developed without being detected by royal security services represented a serious breakdown that could not be allowed to recur. "Additionally," Lady Margaret continued, "I think we need to consider the international implications of today's events. The foreign dignitaries present have witnessed unprecedented political turmoil, and we need to manage how today's events are reported and interpreted in neighboring kingdoms. The international dimension was indeed crucial. The kingdom's diplomatic relationships and economic partnerships could be affected by perceptions of internal instability or questions about the legitimacy of the royal government. Careful diplomatic outreach would be necessary to maintain confidence in the kingdom's political stability and continuity of leadership." Princess Elena approached Marcus and Lady Margaret with the composure that had characterized her conduct throughout the crisis. "Captain Whitmore, Lady Margaret, I want to thank you both for your support and dedication during what I know has been an extremely challenging day." Her gratitude was genuine and appropriate, but Marcus was more impressed by her immediate focus on future responsibilities and challenges. "I also want to discuss with both of you the lessons we can learn from today's events, and how we can strengthen our institutions to prevent similar challenges from developing in the future," Elena continued. The forward-looking perspective demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership qualities that had been questioned by her political opponents. Rather than focusing on recriminations or celebrations, she was already thinking about systematic improvements and long-term institutional strength. As the throne room gradually emptied and the foreign dignitaries were escorted to reception areas, where diplomatic protocols could address their concerns about the day's events, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary circumstances he had witnessed. The Ravencrest dynasty had faced its most serious internal political challenge in centuries, but had emerged with its constitutional authority intact and its future succession secured. Princess Elena had demonstrated the political maturity and leadership capabilities that would serve her well as future monarch. However, the events had also revealed the existence of organized political opposition that would need to be monitored and addressed through ongoing security and intelligence operations. The kingdom's political landscape had been permanently altered by the public confrontation, and new protocols would be needed to prevent similar challenges from threatening constitutional stability in the future. As evening approached and the palace began to return to normal routines, Marcus knew that his responsibilities as captain of the royal guard had evolved significantly. Protecting Princess Elena and Queen Isabella now involved not only traditional security concerns but also monitoring political developments and maintaining intelligence about potential internal threats to the monarchy. The crown of St. Jindo. Marguerite sat safely in its ceremonial case, and Princess Elena's recognition as heir apparent had been formally completed despite the unprecedented challenges that had been mounted against it. The Ravencrest dynasty would continue, strengthened by the trials it had faced and the constitutional principles it had successfully defended. The late afternoon sun finally set beyond the palace walls, bringing to a close a day that would be remembered in the kingdom's history as the moment when the monarchy proved its resilience against internal political challenges and demonstrated the strength of constitutional government in the face of organized opposition. Captain Marcus Whitmore stood ready to protect the future that Princess Elena would inherit, knowing that today's trials had prepared both the monarchy and its guardians for whatever challenges lay ahead.